IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, I am Sarthak and I welcome you all to yet another episode of All Things Policy. As we are recording this episode, there is a stalemate going on between center and some of the states. And the reason for the stalemate is GST compensation. As per the 2017 GST law, the center has to compensate the states for revenue losses that the states might have to incur because they became part of a new taxation architecture. But 2020 has been an extraordinary year. When I'm saying extraordinary, not in a positive sense, GST collections have been low, and the Union Finance Minister announced that center is not in a position to compensate the states. In fact, the Union Finance Minister attributed this to an act of God, and the states have been provided two alternatives. They can borrow money from the RBI, so there is a window for that, and the other option is the states can borrow from the open markets. And this has been a contentious issue for the last couple of months. In the recently concluded GST Council meeting, 2/3 of the states have agreed for the window in which they can borrow some amount of money, and the total borrowing amount has also been increased. But many of the states, especially the opposition ruled states, have not agreed to that. So this has been a contentious issue for some time now. So to discuss this, and again to discuss how all these things can impact center-state equations in future, how it is going to impact us as citizens, and what the states need to do, we have with us the head of research, Takshashila Institution, Pranay. Welcome, Pranay, to yet another episode of All Things Policy.
Thanks, Sarthak.
Yeah. So, Pranay, just can you help us understand, first of all, what is this GST? What is this GST compensation all about? How does taxation happen in India? How do states generate their resources? How the center generates its resources? How it is shared between these different institutions?
Yeah, that's a big question. So, Sarthak, before we get started on this, I will just say that we don't use the word center generally. I don't use it, at least, because it makes us feel that we who are not in Delhi are at the periphery, and that is the center. So, in fact, one thing that Dr. Govind Rao is India's foremost public finance expert, he mentioned that there is no mention of this word center in the constitution at all. So the constitution only uses union and states. So anyways, that was being pedantic, but I think it is important.
Point noted.
Yeah. So let's talk about the union and state and what is the difference between it, right? So now constitutionally, if you see broadly, the way it is envisaged is that the union government is responsible for providing physical infrastructure, so defense, security, all the things required for defense, security, etc. are with the union government, and social infrastructure is in the domain of the states, right? So states are the primary mover when it comes to your health, your education, to your social welfare schemes, everything. The front and center of that is the state governments. Okay, so they are the primary driver. So that's why if you see on the expenditure count, if you look at all governments of India combined, around 58 to 60% of expenditure happens at the state government level. Okay, so remaining is with the union government, and there will be some small portion with the local governments combined, right? So this is an important distinction. It means that state governments have a lot of responsibility, right? Now, when you say state governments have so much money to spend, they spend 60% of the money, you will ask the question, how do they raise money, right? How do they make money? So that's where the imbalance is. So state governments totally make up just 38% of the total revenues, whereas they spend close to 58% of the expenditure, right? So this is a 20% gap between what the states earn and what the states have to spend. right? So this is the gap, and this gap is mitigated through what we call transfers. Okay, so transfers are basically funds that are devolved from one level of the government to the other, and that is done in order to so that they can then spend on the amount that is required, right? So transfers happen in India in two ways. One is through something called the Finance Commission, right? So most of Finance Commission transfers are general purpose in the sense that they are not tied to any particular purpose. They are just like a cash which is given from one level of the government to the other. So the way it operates is a lot of our personal income tax, the corporate tax, these are the big taxes that many of the people who would be listening to this podcast, they pay, right? So these funds directly go to the union government. We file ITR returns every year, right? So that go to the union government, and then after that there is a body which is called the Finance Commission. It is a constitutional body, so it decides a formula based on which money is divided between the union government and state government, and between various state governments as well. So based on that formula, some amount of money goes to the state governments as transfers. This is one route, right? One route to make up for this deficiency of earning ability of the states. The second way this money comes in is called grants, which are made by the union government for specific purposes. So when you have centrally sponsored schemes like NREGS or National Health Mission, the union government gives say 60% of the money in a particular state. The state government contributes some portion as well. So this leads to state government having more money to spend on, let's say, health, education, etc. Right. So that is the second way in which this deficit is made up for. Okay. So now let's come to GST. Where does GST fall into it? So like I said, one big portion of the taxes that we give is something called the direct taxes or taxes on income, right? So these are personal income tax, corporate tax, and all that. The second large category of taxes is consumption taxes, right? These are the taxes which you pay on consumption. So every time you buy a product, you are basically paying some tax, right? And these are paid by everyone, irrespective of the income that you earn. Every time you fill petrol in your vehicle, you are paying for it, right? So these consumption taxes were generally divided between various levels of governments. So you had value added taxes, you had various kinds of excise duties. You had taxes at local government, state government, union government, all those things, right? So what the GST architecture did was that sort of consolidated all these variety of taxes into one consumption tax, which is called the GST. And in the GST, you have divisions between what goes to the union, what goes to the state, and what is shared between states, right? So that is what you have GST, SGST, IGST, right? So that's broadly it. And what was done in order to bring this reform was that states were fearful that if they give away a part of their taxation right as part of this GST, right? Now, no state can increase GST on a particular product or by themselves. Earlier they could do that, right? So now because of GST, this is harmonized. So this has to be approved in the GST Council for any rate change to happen. So states obviously didn't want to let go of this. So in return of this fact that they are giving away their taxation powers, there was this compromise evolved, which was called the compensation cess. So the compromise was that for the next 5 years, if there is a deficiency in the revenue growth, and the deficiency was calculated as year on year 14% revenues have to increase from 2016-17. If the revenues earned by the state are less than this 14% amount, the difference will be given by the union government through something called the compensation. And that compensation, to make money for that compensation, a cess was levied on all of us. So a lot of the goods that we have a component called GST compensation cess. So this money which is collected is finally given to state governments in order to get them on board for this reform. That is sort of the big long story about taxes.
Yeah. So, and this, the fear part and how to overcome that fear, the trust part, this is something which is very important. And right now, as the union finance minister has said that they cannot they cannot provide the compensation to the states. So it seems as if there can be implications of this. There can be mistrust in the center-state relations in future, because this was the reason to address that fear, to address that issue. You had created this provision, but you are backing down right now. So the center-state relations can get impacted here. Do you also see the same thing here in future?
Yeah, definitely. See, this is what the importance in any kind of political reform is, the fact that some compromises have to be made, right? So the compromise was clear that state governments are giving away their taxation powers. In return, union government has agreed to compensate for the next 5 years at least. Now, that is the compact which was made, and that is sort of being foregone by one level of the government, right? And that sort of vitiates the environment, because future compromises become that much more difficult. For example, what this does is, and states are unlikely to sort of agree to future bargains like this. So, for example, we still don't have petroleum products under GST, right? And that's why we pay a humongous amount of tax in for petrol, and there are taxes on taxes and whatever, right? So, if it is brought under GST, there will be some respite to the consumers. But for that to happen, the state governments have to agree to giving this up, right? And there has to be some compromise again, which has to be evolved. But because of this precedent which has been set by the union government, this is unlikely to happen soon, right? So, as citizens, we unfortunately will have to keep bearing the high prices of petrol and diesel, which keep going up, even though the global crude prices are way lower than what they were a few years ago. And we are just paying high purely because of taxes that states and union governments both are charging.
Also, I mean, when we look at reforms, I mean, reforms are not necessarily a one-time thing, right? It has to, I mean, they're mostly incremental, they're dynamic, it has to continuously evolve over a period of time. So future bargains are very, very important. And the example that you have given is apt here. Apart from that, the number of slabs that we have right now, that also somewhere we have to rationalize. For all these things, we will need, I mean, the union has to, again, union and the states, they all have to come to the same table and negotiate. So the trust issues can create problems in future. On top of that, if states do not have sufficient resources, then again, their spending on health, education, law and order, all these things will get impacted, which eventually is going to impact the citizens. And not only this, one more thing I was thinking about. See, if the union is giving the states some options that you can go and borrow from RBI, or you can borrow from the open markets, it also exposes them to some risks, right? Already the states do not have very good debt servicing capacities. So it makes them even more vulnerable in this scenario.
Yeah, and the states have, because of COVID-19, the states have also been badly hit, right? There are no revenue streams coming in. There are no ways that they have been able to raise money with the existing things that they have been doing. So, given that there was this compact, and that is also going away, it's going to hurt them, right? And I think you made an important point about the fact that many of these reforms are not one-shot things. You have to keep evolving. So everyone now knows that GST has so many flaws still. The technology needs to be improved. It needs to be made more user-friendly. Also the rates that need to be reduced. All those things just become difficult. You also have this inverted duty structure, basically inputs being priced at higher taxes compared to outputs, which leads to a peculiar situation where which is all set for corruption, right? Corruption can easily happen if you have inverted duty structure in the system. So all those things are there, and we should remember that again, states are at the forefront of things on health, education, law and order, roads, which are with states and local governments, all these things which are so close to the citizen, and the things that we want to improve on a day-to-day basis, and we actually encounter these things on a day-to-day basis, if those are not provided for, it impacts us a lot more, right? And this is what's likely to happen because of this.
In fact, right now, as we are dealing with the pandemic, it is the states who are at the forefront when it comes to providing, or when it comes to providing for healthcare workers, frontline workers. They are the ones. I mean, and on this also they will be spending. The expenditure will definitely be more. And on top of that, you do not have sufficient revenue stream. So, I mean, all these things raise questions, also we can see that there might be some opportunity as well. So, rather than states, what we have seen is the union is providing some sort of compensation to the states, and as you have rightly pointed out, that this compensation was for 5 years. That was that is according to the the 2017 GST laws. So means that after 2022, the states will not be getting that compensation. So they should anyway be prepared for these kind of eventualities. So what we need to understand is, I mean, all these things, they were all for a temporary measure, that this 5 years compensation. The states need to be prepared to ensure that they have sufficient revenues in future. So
actually, Sarthak, I think in the latest GST Council there was an agreement probably that they might
extend beyond
this
July 2022.
GST compensation, to beyond July 2022, but it might go to another 5 years or whatever.
But it is not something.
We have to understand that it is not an optimal system, right? And especially not because for the citizens, right? We have to, we end up paying a lot more cess. And the whole purpose of GST was to have a uniform rate, right? Now, because of these cesses, you have these cesses are levied on luxury goods or sin goods, etc. So there are actually, instead of having 4 or 5 rates, because of these cesses, we end up having permutation combinations of many more taxes. So the whole purpose of GST is defeated with these kind of cesses. So they should go away. That is for the citizen. And for the states, like you rightly said, that some year down the line it's going to go away anyway. So they have to find other mechanisms to overcome this kind of loss.
And also one more thing, I mean, the states themselves, they have potential to raise more revenue, and they have not done that. In fact, the data that we see from RBI and our own analysis, we have seen that many states, they have untapped potential. They can generate more revenue. They have not been doing that. So if you look at different states, right, how do states get their revenue? As you have pointed out, there are primarily 4 ways by which states get revenue for their different kind of expenditure. One is they from taxation, from taxing their own resources, they can get revenue. They get some share from the central taxes. Sometimes they can generate their own non-tax revenue. And fourth one, they get grants from the center. Now, if you analyze how much revenue they are generating on their own, that will be basically the sum total of their own tax revenues and their own non-tax revenues, and you compare it with different parameters. You will observe that different states have different capacities. Now, what we had done is basically we tried to find out what is the ratio of own revenue generated to GSDP, the gross state domestic product. If a state has high GDP, that means it has high capacity to raise taxes. So own revenue, total revenue by GSDP, it is something which will denote how much they are utilizing their own potential to generate revenue. So if the ratio is high, that means they are using their potential to the maximum. If the ratio is low, there lies some untapped potential. And here we observe that there are many states which are among those high performing states, but they'll have untapped potential. For example, Gujarat, it just raises around 7% of its revenue as compared to its GSDP. And again, there are states like Orissa, Chhattisgarh, which are comparatively poor states, but for them this percentage is much more.
Yeah. So this is an important point, Sarthak, just to sort of rewind a bit. What we are trying to do here is to say that, we now know that union government has gone back on a compact, and union government is to blame for the current thing on the GST compensation cess. But if we look ahead for 10-15 years, we should also realize that state governments are not holier than thou in this in any way. State governments also have a lot of issues that they have let go of, especially on the taxation front, and they are not taxing people that they could have. Yeah? And when we say taxing, we are not talking definitely about increasing tax rates. It's just that they have let go of many of the opportunities to tax properties, to tax agricultural income tax. So these and charge for services, etc. So these are the problems that exist with states. So we wanted to look at what are the things that states can do on their own in the future and not be so dependent on the union government. And that's where we came to this idea of looking at what are the tax revenues with the states, what are the non-tax revenues with the state, and let's look at how they are doing. So now coming to the point that you mentioned, right? Now this is an interesting measure looking at states' own revenues. So these are revenues which are completely generated by the state machinery, by the taxation powers given to the states under the constitution. Right, and there are still some taxation powers with the states, even with the GST, right? So the states can raise taxes on some other items. So we sort of, if we look at the total revenues, like you said, GSD, if you look at it as a percentage of GSDP, you will get a measure of how well the state is doing. Given its own income status, right? If you didn't look at normalization with respect to GSDP and you just look at states' own revenues collected, they will very highly correlate with your own income levels, right? So, for example, there will be Maharashtra, Karnataka will have very high own revenues compared to a state like Odisha, for example, right? But if we then normalize with respect to GSDP, we'll get a good measure that given the economy that you already have, what is it that you are doing to collect, to raise taxes from within the economy that you have? And that was an interesting thing. Like you said, Odisha does quite well, Chhattisgarh does quite well, J&K does quite well on this. Tamil Nadu is one of the economically better states, high income states, which is also doing good on this count. But there are many states like Gujarat, which is not doing well. Andhra Pradesh also is in the lower half. So what can we learn from this?
Yeah, so I mean, it shows that there is untapped potential here. More revenue can be generated by some states like Gujarat who are at the bottom. They can probably increase, again, how do they increase the total tax? Again, it depends how they will do it. But yeah, there is definitely some untapped potential. And if they have to raise the total tax, generally we have two things here, right? Total tax is the product of the tax base and the tax rates. Tax base is how much economic activity you are taxing, what kind of sectors you are taxing, how many people are engaged in those sectors. And tax rate is, again, what is the percentage of tax here? Generally, what happens in case of India is there are certain goods and services we have been taxing, and if you have to increase the tax, you just increase the tax rate, because that is something which is less politically, I mean, it's a more easy solution, politically easy solution, because if you start taxing a new sector, it might become slightly politically inconvenient. But we have to consider that there are some economic activities which we might have to start taxing. For example, in case of India, agriculture is not considered. I mean, there is very few states tax on agriculture. There are some states, but not many states. And in fact, hardly 0.03% or something like that we get from agriculture. So we have to look at all these measures. We have to find out ways by which the tax base can be increased. Because if you are only increasing the tax rate, what will happen is there is a negative correlation. If the tax rates are very high, people will find out ways of not paying taxes. Again, there can be a parallel economy can be there, and people might evade taxes. So we have to find out those ways. And it is not just about taxes. We have also observed that when it comes to non-tax revenues, okay, that can also be a source of income.
Sarthak, to broadly divide states' own revenue, like you were mentioning, there is one tax revenue source. So these are all taxes which state governments put. And the second part is non-tax revenue, which is basically services, user charges that we
Economic
pay.
services, fiscal
So you
services,
were
etc.
talking about taxes first, and you mentioned about how agricultural income tax is a big untapped potential here. The second one, I think, which within the tax that we should discuss is this idea about property taxes as well, right? So
Yeah,
what
correct.
the way it is fashioned again is that under properties you also have stamp duties and registration duties, which are with the state governments. So state governments basically levy a stamp duty whenever you purchase it. I'm sure people would be aware of that whenever they have sort of tried to do any property transactions. So that money directly goes to the state governments. Now we know that a lot of it is untapped because of the corruption and the mafia which exists in this land sector. The second part of it is property tax itself. This is the yearly tax that you pay on the flat or the plot that you own. Now, generally, in most of the states, this property tax is given away to the local bodies, right? So you have, for example, if you are in Bangalore, it is the BBMP which gets all the property taxes. So now it is an important thing that this particular tax revenue is also like big untapped potential, because there was an economic survey study as well. They basically tried to look at the land values and then see the actual collections of property taxes, and they found that even in a state like Karnataka and in a city like Bangalore, which is much better in terms of technology on property tax collection compared to most other cities in India, we are only utilizing 20% of the potential. So the total collections on property taxes are just 20% of what they could be. So this is an important part, because if property taxes go higher, then the local bodies are able to earn their own monies. And when that happens, the state governments will have less money to transfer to these local bodies, right? So that way, if local bodies are sustainable, the pressure on state governments will also decrease. So this is another idea. Agricultural income tax and property taxes, also stamp duties for properties. These are areas which more people need to be brought under the bracket. No need to increase the rate, but the states now need to do something to bring more people under the tax net.
Yeah, exactly. So, there are different ways by which you can increase the taxes, which have not been done till now, which has to be leveraged now. And apart from that, non-tax revenues, and so that is again.
What is that? Can you give broadly which are the non-tax revenues?
Yeah. So there are different kinds of non-tax revenues. For example, the state provides different kind of services. It provides fiscal services. It provides economic services. For example, sometimes PSUs are maintained by the states. It provides different kind of economic services. These PSUs will fall under this economic services. Sometimes it provides general services. For example, law and order. That is what state provides. Sometimes there will be a fine because you are probably violating some traffic rules, regulations. All these things will come under general services. So these services are provided by the state, and whatever charges or whatever fees are charged from the users, they all fall under this category, the non-tax revenue part. For example, if the state is conducting exams, it might be charging students some fees for that. So all these things will come under there. If the state is generating power, electricity, so it might charge users for that. Some states like Kerala, they organize lotteries as well, and they make a lot of money out of that. 9,000 crores Kerala makes on an average every year from lotteries. So all these things fall under the non-tax revenue part, and these are all own non-tax revenue part. So here also, some states you will find they are doing well, and some states they are not doing well. So some states, what they have done, they have some comparative advantage. They have used that to raise revenues. An example is Jammu Kashmir, which generates 6% of its own revenue from power itself. Then states like Chhattisgarh, they also have some advantage. They are using that. But thing to be noted here is this stream of revenue is also something which is not, which has been quite volatile. Economic surveys also pointed this out, that it has remained volatile. There is also untapped potential here, which can be leveraged further.
Yeah, no, this is a really important point. Basically, what we are saying is that state governments are, if they are providing a service, they are not charging the users adequately for that. So whenever you have undercharging or underpricing of a good, exploitation of that good happens, right? Overconsumption happens, and that's why you see that water is overconsumed in our cities by people who actually get water from the city government, and they are very few and lucky people in the city. So that is what happens, and that's why a good principle to follow is what is called this Vixelian rule, right? So whenever possible, you should charge for private goods. So if you do have properly designed and implemented user fee, the states have a continuing source of revenue which can come in, right? So, for example, if they are providing power, then if they charge at charge at a rate which conveys the scarcity, they can first convey the seriousness of consuming and conserving that particular commodity, and also they can raise revenue out of it, which can be used for various purposes, right? So that is an important thing. So pricing scarce resources such as water for irrigation will reduce overconsumption, and it will help state governments make money. So that's one area which again state governments need to concentrate on.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there are ways by which revenues can be generated. If one state is doing it, then why not other states? Different states have their own comparative advantage, right? So probably they need to look at that, and also they can learn from one another. So that is one of the key learnings that probably states need to inculcate in the next few years if they have to become independent. They don't have to be dependent on the union.
I think that comparative advantage point is very nice. So, for example, there will be, like you said, J&K, the erstwhile state of J&K used to raise a significant amount of money on power. Even Chhattisgarh does well on the fact that it sells power to other states. So, it's about states identifying their own strengths and then charging them nominally, but charging as many people as possible, especially if it is a private good, right? It is not a good which which has externalities or which is a public good, but goods which are consumed by people, they are rivalrous and they are excludable. So if those are the kind of goods that the government is supplying, then it should charge for it. And first, eventually the state government should be asking, why is it supplying that good? Any private party can also supply power, for example, and it can then tax the private power provider, and the state government can just make money through that route. So those are the things that need to be looked at. But eventually what we are saying is that whether it's through the tax route or whether through it's a non-tax route, it is for the state governments to take the responsibility in their own hands and chart a path so that they can gradually get out of this fiscal trouble and not be dependent on union government largesse all the time.
Yeah, Pranay, I think you concluded it really well. I mean, this is the key point that we have been trying to drive. So thank you all for joining us for this episode. We look forward to you joining again tomorrow. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, for supporting us. So Jasleen Royal came on Storytellers and Storytellers this week with Vineet. It was a really interesting conversation. Do definitely check that out. Hamsini Hariharan is back on the Pragati podcast after an extended absence. Hamsini was one of the original hosts along with Pravan, but she was unable to continue. But we're glad to have her back. She's talking about her experiences since she left. She's been studying in China. Definitely check that out. You'll enjoy that. Abhijit Ganguly was on Cyrus Says a couple of weeks ago, and he had such a great time, and we were so happy to have him on that we asked him to join us for Cock and Bull, and he was on this week. Do check that out. And lastly, I'd like to mention our Tamil show. We've been doing a show called Kadai Podcast Ponniyin Selvan, hosted by Kavita Jiva. She has been phenomenal. She's rewritten the stories in a way which really, they speak to a modern audience. But Ponniyin Selvan is over, and she started a new story, though. The new story that she started is Sivakamiyan Sabatham. I'm sure I mangled that pronunciation, and I'm sure you'll love it if you're a Tamil speaker. Do definitely check it out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.